Good evening. I'm Dr. Charlotte DeCoster, the Senior Director of Education at the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum. It is my pleasure to welcome you tonight to tonight's History Highlights program, The Battle of the Bulge. I'd like to start this evening by extending a special thank you to our community partners for this program. Green Hill School, the Legacy Senior Communities, Remembering Black Dallas, Southwest Jewish Congress. Thank you all so much for your support of the museum. I'd also like to extend a special welcome to our board members, museum members, and volunteers watching tonight, as well as anyone that is new to our programming at the museum. Your support helps us continue to offer programs like these. We will leave time at the end of today's program for questions. Please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to type out and submit your questions, and we will answer as many as we can. I'm excited to introduce Dr. Cameron Zinsou as tonight's speaker. He is an assistant professor in the Department of Military History at the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College in Fort Leavenworth in Kansas. In 2021, he received his PhD in history from Mississippi State University. He currently has a manuscript under contract with the University Press of Kansas titled Occupied: Requisition, Citizenship, and Meaning in World War II France. The work reframes the French civilian experience in World War II, defined chiefly by French defense law and exploited by other governing authorities throughout the rest of the conflict. Dr. Zinsou maintains an active dialogue with the public, appearing in numerous podcast episodes and a television appearance. And his work has been featured in the New York Times and War on the Rocks. I'd like to now invite him to begin his presentation.
All right. Thank you so much, Charlotte. And thank you to the Dallas Holocaust Museum for giving me this opportunity to speak with everyone this evening. I'm very, very excited. So, the Battle of the Bulge. Today is the 80th anniversary. On 16 December 1944, throngs of German soldiers broke through the Ardennes forest and surprised the Allies in what would become the deadliest battle the United States Armed Forces would fight in the Second World War. It certainly marks a contrast of, one side declining in desperation and another ascendant, anticipating the end of the war. So I'm not going to give a blow-by-blow battle or a blow-by-blow account of the battle. Rather, I'm going to situate the Battle of the Bulge in the larger strategic context of the Second World War, primarily as it nears the end of it. So we're going to start with the strategic context, talk a bit about the war in the West, a little bit about the Eastern Front, and then we'll move into the plans. What are the Allies thinking? What are the Germans thinking? And then we'll briefly cover the battle itself. And at the end, we'll cover the significance. So, 1944 had been a whirlwind year for the Allies. It began on June 6, 1944, with the Allied landings in Normandy. Operation Overlord signaled the beginning of the end for the Second World War, especially in Europe. Operation Overlord coincided with a large operation from the Russians on the Eastern Front, known as Operation Bagration. And throughout the summer of 1944, Germany fought on two fronts, trying to hold the Allies in the Normandy bridgehead and trying to stop the giant Russian machine in the east. By the end of July 1944, the Allies had managed to break out in what's known as Operation Cobra. In the east, the Soviets made huge gains, effectively destroying an entire German army group and sending the Germans retreating upwards of 500 miles from the initial starting point of those campaigns. Throughout the remainder of the summer, the Allies in the West would chase the Germans back to the Franco-German border in an attempt to wipe out as many German formations as possible. Accompanying this dash across France was the Allied landings in southern France, known as Operation Dragoon. And this together constituted a major success for the Allies. Now, it hadn't unfolded exactly as they had planned. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, commander, Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, believed that a steady, broad front offensive would gradually push the Germans back over time. However, they were met with stout resistance, followed by an epic and rapid collapse. As we transition from August to September 1944, the Germans begin an almost miraculous recovery. Their formations are completely disorganized, and it seems that the war might even be over by Christmas. Famous last words, if you ever hear anyone say that. The Allies, a product of their own success, suffer what we like to call catastrophic success, i.e., not planning for major rapid advances. And as such, they essentially run out of supplies. As the summer transitions to the fall, Allied gains slow down. In the east, the Russians begin another offensive into the Balkans, again generating huge amounts of success, such that by the time we're getting to the fall and transitioning toward the winter of 1944, the Germans are hard-pressed on every side, struggling to maintain their lines. Now, I briefly referenced the broad front approach, and this characterized Allied strategic planning, debates, and problems for a long time, for essentially since the Allies landed all the way through the end of the war. As I mentioned, General Eisenhower was a big proponent of a broad front approach, putting pressure along all parts of the German line so that the Germans, hard-pressed for men and material, would have a difficult time putting reinforcements at any one given point to stop an Allied advance. And gradually, this would cause the disintegration of the German line. However, others under Eisenhower's command, namely Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, the commander of the 21st Army Group and the highest ranking British general or officer who will command forces on the Western Front, preferred what he called the narrow front approach. He wanted all Allied armies to stop except for those under his command so that he could make a bold, narrow push using a preponderance of power and supplies behind his army group to push into the Netherlands and then into the north of Germany, whereby it might unhinge the German line and allow for a rapid decision to be made. Now, this becomes a large point of contention in memoirs and in debates in the post-war. Eisenhower, for his part, because the Allies are approaching all kinds of supply issues, he doesn't want to take a risky gamble, especially because a lot of ports, namely Antwerp, have not yet come fully online, allowing for a rapid, big push and offensive. Also, at this point in the war, putting all of your efforts, all of your eggs in one basket behind Montgomery, while not allowing other Allied armies to advance, would then allow possibly the Germans to recover in other parts of the line, making an overall advance more difficult. And in fact, Eisenhower already allowed Montgomery one attempt at this during Operation Market Garden in September of 1944, which ultimately failed in its objectives. So what are Allied plans as we get into the fall, September, October, November 1944? Well, the Germans along the Franco-German border and the the Franco-German border and the Belgian-German border have constructed a line and series of defenses known as the Siegfried Line. And this was kind of a series of obstacles that ran along the length of the German border that would make it difficult for the Allies to penetrate. And indeed, they had a significantly difficult time doing so throughout the fall of 1944. In addition, the United States First Army under Courtney Hodges had been engaged in the Battle of the Hurtgen Forest for the majority of the fall, leading to stalemate, difficult conditions, heavy rain, mud, forest, hills, easily defensible positions. What had emerged was a stalemate. And the attrition that the Allies were suffering meant that they had to rest and refit for what they anticipated would be the upcoming final offensive into Germany, which Eisenhower anticipated launching sometime in early January of 1945. As such, although local actions would occur, this would be a time to retrain units, to introduce new units into Allied lines, to allow them to begin greening themselves, getting some experience on the front line, and to save up the logistics and the supplies necessary to push the final offensive into Germany. Again, there was some debate at Allied headquarters about whether this was the correct decision to take. Eisenhower, in his capacity as Supreme Allied Commander, however, took this choice. As an indicator as to the heavy attrition that the Allies faced, of 120,000 soldiers under Courtney Hodges' command, roughly 33,000 would become casualties during the Battle of the Hurtgen Forest, with around 12,000 killed in action. Here's the Allied order of battle. Now, it's not the complete Allied order of battle. Some observers may notice, for instance, the 6th Army Group under Jacob Devers is not present under this order of battle. I just wanted to highlight the chief Allied formations that would participate in the Battle of the Bulge. So we have Eisenhower as Supreme Allied Commander at SHAEF. Under him are 2 army groups, the 12th Army Group under Lieutenant General Omar Bradley, and the 21st led by the aforementioned Montgomery. Bradley has under him 3 armies, the 1st Army, the 3rd Army under George Patton, and 9th Army under Lieutenant General William Simpson. Also under SHAEF's command are Allied Air Forces under General Carl Spaatz. Now, the Germans, why would they, in a place and time where they are obviously on the decline, everyone senses that it's just a matter of time before the Germans lose. Nazi leader Adolf Hitler had had an assassination attempt against him on July 20th, 1944. Some of you may be familiar with the film Valkyrie that depicts this attempt. And ever since, Hitler, already overstressed and overburdened with the demands of the war, this assassination attempt takes him to a whole new level of paranoia. He doesn't leave his command bunker. He's suffering from all kinds of medical ailments. He's not sleeping well. And he's increasingly deluded about the prospects of German success. He sways back and forth between outlandish schemes to win the war and outright depression. But why the Ardennes? The Ardennes, as we'll talk about in a little bit, is not typically an area that one would associate with launching offensives that would produce rapid battles of movement where units are racing across the battlefield. Well, in 1914, at the beginning of World War I, the Germans sent 1 million soldiers through the Ardennes. And more famously in 1940, it is the principal site of where German mechanized forces were able to sneak through and surprise Allied forces at the beginning of the Battle of France, leading to the fall and collapse of France. In just 6 weeks, a surprising battle and outcome, to say the least. Let's talk a bit about some of the specific problems that Germany are having. For instance, in the month of September 1944, German ordnance will explode 70,000 tons of explosives. However, German factories are only producing half of that. In 1944, on average, the Germans will suffer 50,000 dead, military members dead, per month the entirety of that year. And the manpower shortage becoming so acute, in the latter half of 1944, Hitler will lower the recruitment age for soldiers to 16 and raise it to 50, meaning that you have far younger people getting put into uniform and far older people getting into uniform. I can't imagine ever wanting to be enlisted in uniform at the age of 50. I would have a difficult time imagining myself being in a uniform right now at the age of 36. The planning for the Battle of the Bulge, or Wacht am Rhein, as the Germans call it, became to Hitler in almost of a fever dream as he was recovering from an ailment in September 1944. Part of his calculation for beginning this operation is that he believed that Allied morale would crack, that disputes between the British and the Americans would lead to a rapid collapse. Well, how would that rapid collapse happen? Hitler envisioned, much in the mold of 1940, a grand offensive, one that would split at the Allies in half, and much like happened in 1940, separate the British from their allies. So we can see here on the right that two armies, the 6th Panzer Army and the 5th Panzer Army, would cut a hole through Allied lines, separating the British from the Americans, principally targeting Courtney Hodges' 1st Allied Army. So he thought, if we can just get this to happen, if we can get to Antwerp, if we can cut the Allies in half, Churchill, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, and US President Franklin D. Roosevelt would come to the negotiating table. He could find an armistice of some kind that would allow him to then transfer his forces to the east to stop the Soviets. Of course, this was a wildly inaccurate reading of Allied command relationships and the Anglo-American alliance more broadly. Additionally, as is a penchant in German military planning, they vastly overestimated the capabilities that they had at their own disposal. Now, while the 6th and the 5th Panzer armies would receive the newest units, the newest and best material, and the most reinforcements, in total, they would never have any more than 400,000 or 450,000 soldiers at the front, where the Allies, by comparison, can draw on a vast well of manpower that they had in theater. The Germans would launch a diversionary operation in the southern part of the line called Operation Nordwind, and this would be a spoiling attack against the 6th Army Group, which is commanded by General Jacob Devers, near the Swiss-German Franco border. But that was just designed to tie down units to prevent them from reinforcing the planned blow. Now, when Hitler brought this idea to his generals, there was almost a uniform resistance to it initially. Gerhard von Rundstedt, commander in the West, thought that it was completely unfeasible. Walter Model, another principal Axis commander, agreed. And instead, they proposed what they called the small solution. It would be a much more circumscribed assault that would cut off the First and Ninth US armies and not have this grand objective toward Antwerp. In his vision, Hitler thinks that he can destroy upwards of 30 Allied divisions. By contrast, this small solution or little solution would only destroy, hopefully, 10 to 15 Allied divisions. Hitler, understanding Nazi Germany's desperate situation, rejected it out of hand, saying that it wouldn't alter the overall picture. Much like numerous other times during the war, Hitler gambled big. All the dice on one operation. To prepare for this operation, Hitler insisted on the strictest discipline. Units weren't giving orders until the 11th hour or maps. The staging areas were very well guarded. They employed one of the few major intelligence deception operations that succeeded for the Germans during the war, making up fake army groups, fake units, and aware that Allied spies could be anywhere, having generals loudly proclaim in dining halls that they were going to attack somewhere that's completely separate from where they ended up attacking. As previously mentioned, Hitler also assigned the best and newest equipment to the 5th and 6th Panzer armies. To highlight this, Germany will produce 1,345 new armored vehicles in November of 1944. Of those, they will only send 288 to the Eastern Front. The remainder will be to the West, to these armies for this last gamble. And it's noteworthy here to emphasize how much that disparity matters. 80% of all German soldiers who die in World War II will die on the Eastern Front. That theater is significantly, far and away, absorbing far more German manpower than anything that happens in the front. So for the East to receive that little new equipment when the Germans are so desperate for it, and for the West to receive all that new equipment, really is a statement of intent. Now, the German order of battle, Hitler's supreme commander of Axis forces. His direct subordinate is Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, who had been in various commands in the West for the majority of the war. Army Group B, commanded by Field Marshal Walter Model, is the direct operational commander for the Battle of the Bulge. You'll see on the map to the left that there are 3 principal sectors where the German armies will be deployed. You have the 6th Panzer Army under Field Marshal Dietrich, and you have the 5th Panzer Army under Lieutenant General Hansel von Manteuffel. In the south, you have the 7th Army led by Lieutenant General Erich Brandenberger. Now, for simplicity's sake, I use the direct American rank equivalent for clarity and simplicity's sake. The 7th Army's goal would be to guard and protect the German left flank as the 2 Panzer armies directly to the north would advance. Dietrich's army, which had 4 full Panzer divisions in it, was the strongest of the three armies that would fight. There were nine divisions in total, four of which are panzers. Manteuffel had 7 divisions, including 2 panzer divisions. It's worth noting that the 6th Panzer Army was an SS Panzer Army, and so 4 SS Panzer divisions accompanied them. So we essentially have the setup. These 3 armies, especially the 6th and the 5th in the north, Panzer armies, would break through, crush Allied lines, seize bridge crossings at the Meuse River, which were vital if these German tanks were going to get across, and then race up towards Antwerp. German formations were expected to get to the Meuse in the original battle scheme in 24 to 36 hours, a very rapid rate of advance. They were expected to be in Antwerp no later than 4 days after the beginning of the battle, which again would require a remarkable feat of generalship, of soldiering, of Allied disintegration and inability to respond. In short, everything had to go right at every single step of the way for the Germans to succeed. We have here the principal layouts of where everyone is. So we have Dietrich in the north for the Germans, Manteuffel, the 5th Panzer Army, and then Brandenburger in the south. For the Allies, we have General George Patton on the right flank, Courtney Hodges, whose first army will receive the brunt of the German assault, Lieutenant General William Simpson with 9th Army, and then farther north, the British and the 21st Army Group. And these are the principal dispositions of both forces on the eve of the battle, 15 December. Now, I mentioned that the Ardennes doesn't seem like it should be the best place for quick, rapid maneuver. And there's a very good reason for that. The Ardennes region is heavily wooded. It's very hilly. There are ravines and twists and turns and lots of narrow roads that you have to navigate. The Germans in 1940, for instance, were terrified that Allied aircraft would spot them and that in doing so would bomb their columns traversing these narrow roads in ways that would completely stifle the assault. They were hoping for much the same this time around, that Allied planes would not see them. The problem with that is that the Allies maintained air superiority all over the Western Front. In post-war accounts, the Germans remark 2 principal things about the Allies: that they had overwhelming amounts of artillery to deploy at any time, and that they never saw one of their own planes, and that anytime they heard a plane, they knew it was an Allied plane coming to bomb them. December, however, is a famously terrible time of year for the weather. It's cold, it's foggy, it snows a lot, and 1944 would see one of the worst winters in European memory. So there's all kinds of snow on the ground. Fog has limited visibility, and essentially the entire Allied Air Force is stuck on the ground. So that's one check mark in terms of the things that the Axis need to go right. They also need to make sure that they themselves don't create their own traffic jams along these narrow routes, and that, again, that they quickly dispense with Allied formations. At 5:35 on 16 December 1944, a sharp artillery barrage begins along the front of Allied lines. The first American unit to come under attack the 106th Infantry Division, was a new division that had just been put into the line at the Schnee Eifel. They came under attack by Manteuffel's 5th Panzer Army. Within a day, they are surrounded. And within a day, several other regiments are surrounded, up to the point that eventually 8,000 American soldiers will surrender, the largest mass surrender of American soldiers on the Western Front in World War II. Part of the reason why, for instance, the 106th Division, Infantry Division, fell apart the way that it did was because they were asked to cover 5 times as much land as a regular infantry division could be expected to do. So they were thinly spread across the line. The 14th Cavalry Group had 1,600 men covering 6 square miles. So when German forces plowed into them, the cavalry group was essentially annihilated. Throughout the course of the first day and a half, this huge armored fist under Manteuffel plunges deep into Allied lines, and Allied forces are sent in retreat all over. In the south, Brandenburger makes some limited success. He's not afforded the best equipment. He has no panzer divisions. He's expected to make small incursions into Allied lines so that he can hold the shoulder of the left of the German line. One could argue that the most important element of the German advance lay with Dietrich's 6th Panzer Army. Von Rundstedt once called Dietrich, he's decent but stupid. He had an infamous kind of temper, and in addition, his planning with the Panzer Army wasn't up to standard. SS staff division planners, or operations planners rather, were famous for their inability to construct good, sound, meticulous plans. And in addition to unexpected Allied resistance that slowed their advance, numerous traffic jams slowed the advance of the 6th Panzer Army, so that by the end of the second day, they were already far behind schedule. They were supposed to have already reached the Meuse, which, if you're looking at the screen, is up to the northern part of the screen near Liège. This causes Dietrich to fly into a rage. It causes other German commanders to fly into a rage. They are aware that they are under the gun and that they have to make up as much time as possible. The Allies, by contrast, respond quickly and decisively. General Eisenhower, who at this time is at his headquarters in Versailles, along with Bradley and several other Allied commanders, immediately recognizes that this is a major effort from the Germans. And so not only does he begin to order reserves placed throughout the country to head toward where the German breakthrough has occurred, he also orders General Patton's Third Army to cease its offensive and to reorient itself to come north. Over the course of the next several days, the German incursion continues farther and farther. And by Christmas Eve, the Germans have reached essentially their high water mark, the Bulge, as it's called, due to, as you can see on the screen, this giant incursion into Allied lines. Omar Bradley, whose command as the 12th Army Group commander, is located in Luxembourg, which is to the south of the German advance. As such, Bradley is cut off from 1st and 9th Army, which are to the north of the German penetration. So Eisenhower decides to temporarily transfer command of the 1st and 9th Armies from Bradley to Montgomery. So we have 2 American field armies falling directly under British command. Now, it makes great military sense. Bradley's not able to keep into regular contact with Hodges or with Simpson, and Montgomery from the north can organize the response to the German incursion much better than Bradley would be able to do. Eventually, both armies will get transferred back to Bradley's, but the 9th Army under Simpson won't be transferred back until April of 1945. At the beginning of the battle, we see that the Germans actually outnumber the Allies in the principal sector where it's happened. But on Christmas Eve, the sky clears, and that spells complete doom for German formations. They have hundreds and thousands of people strewn out across roadways all over the Ardennes. And Allied air power makes quick work of many of them, strafing columns of tanks, trucks, and German panzers, already on tight fuel supplies, run out of fuel to continue their advance. One of the major operational factors that the Germans assumed they could account for was that they would capture Allied fuel supplies and the dumps that they would overrun. And those Allied dumps would fuel the German advance all the way to Antwerp. It's operational planning at its worst. Divisions like the 101st Airborne Division and the 82nd Airborne Division, which had currently been resting or refitting about 100 miles away from the front lines at Reims, are ordered into the line, as well as several other units in France. The 101st will famously get inserted at Bastogne, where it will be cut off for several days as Germans continually attack over and over. On the 26th of December, Patton's attack from the south will come, and he'll establish a narrow corridor to Bastogne so that supplies can come in. This second phase of the battle is where we see some of the hardest fighting happen. The Allies, recovered from the initial blow, are standing their ground and are beginning to apply a lot of pressure to German formations. We can see here that even in this second phase, the Allies have already been able to pull 300,000 additional soldiers and hundreds of extra tanks into the battle area, whereas the Germans can only scrounge up an additional 50,000 soldiers. And we can already see that the number of tanks, tank destroyers, and assault guns they have is in rapid decline. The third phase of the battle will see the Allies gradually pushing back the Germans as they have to abandon equipment, supplies, and straggle back across to their initial starting lines, such that by the end of the battle, the Allies have almost 750,000 soldiers in the battle area, whereas the Germans, their numbers essentially stay the same. And as the Allies bring in another 1,000 tanks and hundreds of extra assault guns and tank destroyers, the Germans quickly diminish. Some notable things about the Bulge. I previously mentioned the delays. The delays that the Germans experienced at the beginning of the battle was such that even if everything had gone correctly, the fact that they couldn't get to where they wanted as quickly as they wanted to go on their own accord, not even with Allied intervention, meant that the timetable was hopelessly unrealistic. The Allies, once the weather cleared, were able to bring in the preponderance of their air power across the line. And it wasn't just attacking German formations. The beleaguered forces at Bastogne were able to stay supplied until Patton got there due to Allied airdrops that happened in and around the city. I also mentioned that the weather was horribly cold, that temperatures would drop into the single digits night after night after night, and thousands of soldiers on both sides would either freeze to death or have frostbite, trench foot. Weather was a chief contributing factor to the misery that happened during the Bulge. And lastly, the Germans committed a number of war crimes throughout the Battle of the Bulge, principally with the 6th Panzer Army, and most infamously under Kampfgruppe Peiper. Kampfgruppe Peiper was supposed to be the principal armored thrust for the 6th Panzer Army, led by Joachim Peiper, a colonel who was, a golden child of SS, Waffen SS military units. They will come to capture a number of American soldiers throughout the course of the battle. And at Honsfeld, they'll kill 19 American POWs. At Bühlingen, they'll kill 59. Most infamously, at Malmedy, they will shoot 86 American POWs and kill them. 44 at Stoumont, 58 at Lingenville, and at Stavelot, they will shoot 93 Belgian civilians. In addition, on 17th December, they will capture, torture, and murder 11 African-American soldiers who were part of the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion. The results of the battle were horrific. As I mentioned at the beginning, the Battle of the Bulge will be the deadliest battle for the United States Army on the Western Front in World War II. And it depends on which scholarly source you cite, say from the last week in January or up through the first week of February, depending when they end the battle, your casualty results will vary. So they range anywhere from 89,000 casualties to 108,000. I've gone with the higher number in this instance, including 19,000 killed in action. British casualties, because the British are farther north, only the 30th Corps will essentially get involved in the effort to push the Germans back. This is principally an American battle, but they will suffer around 1,500 casualties. And German casualties, while seemingly less than the Americans, are casualties they can ill afford. When you deploy 400,000 plus soldiers and you have 81,000 casualties out of that, that's almost 25% of a force. At a time when you have children as young as 16 and men as old as 50 getting conscripted to fight, you can ill afford any losses. And when your last reserves are being committed, that's it. There's nothing left to do after that. So what are the consequences for the Battle of the Bulge? Depending on your scholar or academic or historian or history buff you consult, the Battle of the Bulge either shortened or lengthened the war. Arguments for shortening the war say that by committing his last reserve, his last best troops available, that the Germans were left with nothing left to fight the Allies in the West. And as the final Central European campaign will begin in March 1945, entire German formations will just crumble in front of the Allied advance. And again, that's because of the severe lack of quality of the German fighting soldier by the end of the war. Because the Germans committed their last strategic reserve, it meant that they had no one behind to stop any Allied advances once they got over the Rhine River and into Germany. The Battle of the Bulge did delay the Allied entrance into Germany. And so those who argue that the battle lengthened the war will point to that maybe the Allies could have gotten into Germany far earlier than they did, by a month or so, meaning that the Allies could have possibly captured Berlin. Now, the capture of Berlin has its own kinds of political and military issues that fall beyond this presentation. Suffice to say that there are some out there who think that the lapses in Allied intelligence allowed them to be surprised in ways that caused them to take far longer to recover than they would have had to have done otherwise. Notably, for the Allies as well, it also prompted the American deployment of the US Strategic Reserve. Eisenhower not only called all forces in France toward the front, he also called for the deployment of several American divisions that were stateside in the United States to have their deployment pushed up to come to France. Although Eisenhower recognized that the incursion by the Germans was a big one, he was still uncertain as to how far they would advance and how much more striking power they had. And so better safe than sorry. So he calls for a huge additional commitment of American forces to France. Pending your questions, that is all I have for the moment. And thank you for your time and attention.
Thank you, Cameron, for that very thorough review of the Battle of the Bulge. I learned myself so much too. For our participants viewing tonight, if you have any questions for Dr. Zinsou, if you want to put your questions in that Q&A button, then we can see them coming in, and then I can ask those questions for you as well as they come in. And I'm going to make sure. So one of the first questions coming in is, do we know why German forces murdered POWs during the Battle of the Bulge? And do we know why specifically they tortured African-American soldiers?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So principally why, especially most infamously, Kampfgruppe Piper murdered US POWs is it's kind of a twofold answer. The one was the one I addressed when I said that they were in part frustrated by their lack of rapid advance as they were on a tight timetable. The other was the vast majority of the veterans of these panzer units had all seen service on the Eastern Front for years. And the Eastern Front is a completely different character of war than on the Western Front, where the burning down of villages, murdering civilians, murdering Russian POWs, Soviet POWs, was routine and expected. It was a war of barbarism on the East, and it is difficult to extricate once you begin that kind of line of thinking and rationality toward murdering people in a time of war to reverse that. And so the kinds of actions that Kampfgruppe Piper and other SS units during the Bulge displayed were, I'm going to say expected, but the people who were in those units, that behavior had been normalized. And so even if they were under orders to take it easy, as it were, the frustration of the resistance that they came up against with the Americans, in many ways, I'm surprised that more American POWs weren't shot throughout the course of the battle. As with regards to the torture and murder of African-American soldiers, Nazi racial ideology puts Black people very, very, very low on the list as to be, subhuman. And so it is an affront to German soldiers, especially SS, the people in SS units, to even like the gall or the nerve to participate in a racial war that you have no part of being under. We see this happen in 1940 when the Germans capture French colonial soldiers. Hundreds are murdered after they surrender. And again, it's surprising to me, at least, that there weren't more POWs that came into German possessions who were shot during the battle.
Thank you for explaining that. Um, Evan Cohn wrote that his father fought in the Battle of the Bulge under Patton. He was in the 12th Armored Division, 66th Armored Infantry, Battalion Company A, famously known as the Hellcats. And he wanted to just say thank you. Found your talk very interesting. But I wanted to follow up with that. A question with that too is being one of the highest, being the highest casualty battle in World War II for the Americans. What impact did that have on the morale of the regular American soldiers, especially ones that maybe had come in later that maybe had not been at D-Day?
Yeah, that's a great question. So thanks so much for the question. So here's when I get to plug my own family. My great-grandfather, Floyd Renish, enlisted in the Army on 30 June 1944 in Illinois. He was a farmer and didn't want to miss out, so he joined up with a friend or two. And he actually arrives in theater on 12 December. He gets into France. And by 19 December, he's deployed to the front line near the Bulge. And he actually joins the remnants of the 14th Cavalry Group, who had been completely destroyed by the initial German assault. And he fights also in the Battle of the Bulge. And so based on, the very few recollections I've received from other family members over the year, unfortunately, I didn't get to talk much with my great-grandfather about his experiences. So there's kind of the personal recollections that they have, and then there's the overall. Allied forces, morale is generally pretty high leading up to the battle. People are cold, miserable, tired, common things you would want to complain about, but everyone's feeling pretty good. The frontline units, say the 106th Infantry Division or the 99th Infantry Division, the ones who are first deployed, they're new, they don't have a lot of experience. They very quickly break and run. Part of this is because they're facing veteran Wehrmacht units who know, how to just fight better. Part of it's also that in the case of the 106th Division, they initially started training together stateside. But as the manpower needs of United States Army divisions in Europe increased, they started siphoning soldiers off from this division that was training, such that by the time the 106 gets deployed to Europe, they've had to replace 7,000 people in a division of about 14,000. So when you've had to replace at least half of your fighting strength before you ever get to the front line, that's going to lower unit cohesion. That's going to lower your familiarity with people to the left and right of you. And baseline morale is going to be lower. Now, American units are, once the line stabilize, it's basically, it's a hard fight and we're here to beat them back. And so after the initial shock, morale stabilizes. And then I wouldn't say is especially high. Again, the winter of 1944 is an especially cold one. And so living conditions are brutal. My great-grandfather, for instance, recalled having to sleep standing up because if you laid down, there's a chance you could freeze to death in your sleep. And so those are all the various kinds of factors that are influencing Allied morale. And for Patton, Patton soldiers loved him. Ike or General Eisenhower asked him when he can reorient his army to be ready to advance. Eisenhower thinks it'll be somewhere in the region of 6-7 days. Patton tells him it's 3 days. And Patton absolutely does it. In 3 days, he completely turns his entire army to the relief of the southern sector. And that's indicative of the high morale that Patton's Third Army enjoyed because of the fearless leadership of their army commander.
Yes, I've been spent many falls and winters in the Ardennes as a kid, and it can get really cold there. So just a cold alone would take my morale down. So I cannot, and one of the coldest winters in Belgium, I cannot imagine how tough it must have been just arriving at the battle even as well. Let's talk a little bit about the impact on the other side of the
Mhm.
German battlefield, the Soviets. What did the Bulge offer the Soviets a strategic opportunity that they might have used to their advantage?
Yeah, so the bulge essentially the the Russians uh, had been resting and refitting after their excursions from the summer, and by the winter, after the advance at the Bulge fails, the Russians begin their own winter offensive, and begins with the capture of Warsaw and begins pushing all German units in the east even farther back, such that by the end of January and the beginning of February, the Russians and the Soviets are essentially at the Polish-German border, ready to begin the final drive into Germany. So Battle of the Bulge absolutely presents the Soviets with a strategic opportunity that they make maximum use out of.
Um, Very short but very to the point question. What happened to Piper?
So Joachim Piper gets arrested. He goes on trial. He is sentenced. He is released. He takes up a life in France, actually. And in 1976, some Frenchmen with a very long memory assassinate him in his French home. The house is burned down, and they find some burned bodies, including his wife is in there too. Um, but yeah, so Piper actually escapes the worst of, the Nuremberg trials. He's not sentenced to death or anything like that, and like so many other Nazi perpetrator of war crimes are allowed to live lives after the conclusion of the war when they brought deaths to so many millions of people. But in one instance, some Frenchmen took justice into their own hands.
Can you recommend a book or books that best cover the Battle of the Bulge?
Yeah, so Anthony Beaver has a great one on the Battle of the Bulge. Uh, Peter Caddick Williams, Peter Caddick Adams, sorry. Um, he has a Snow and Steel, which is this behemoth 909 page. Imagine if I said it was a behemoth and it's only 9 pages. Uh, Almost 900-page history on the Battle of the Bulge that goes into every nook and cranny. There are chapters in a lot of other books that have really great coverage. So The Guns That Last Light by Rick Atkinson, which is the last book in his Liberation trilogy. Rob Citino takes the German perspective in The Wehrmacht's Last Stand, which is, a favorite of mine and a source I used. There are also A War to Be Won by Alan Millett and Williamson Murray is an operational history of World War II, and they have very strong opinions about the Battle of the Bulge. I would also recommend checking out some of the memoirs of the participants. So Montgomery's memoirs, in which he's very critical of Eisenhower. Eisenhower's own memoir, Crusade in Europe. He gives a nice detailed explanation of the reasons why he makes the decisions that he does during the Battle of the Bulge. I mean, the historiography of the Battle of the Bulge is vast. When anyone asks me, my first recommendation is always go to the U.S. Army Official History, the Green Book series. There are 87 volumes that cover every component of the war in the United States. They're all free to download at the Center for Military History. And so the Battle of the Bulge Green Book is the U.S. Army's official history of what happens. It's initially published in 1965. So it is a bit on the older side, but it still maintains a wealth of great information for anyone who's interested.
Yeah, and I definitely have a little bias towards the Wehrmacht Makes the Last Stand by Dr. Satino. I
Hey,
always
you and me
recommend that
both.
one. And I know that's me. But Dr. Zinsou, I want to just thank you for sharing all of this amazing information with us, giving us really a deep dive into the Battle of the Bulge, and taking your time in this evening with us and answering our questions. We really appreciate it, and we thank you for this amazing educational evening.
Thank you so much, Charlotte. And thanks again to the Dallas Holocaust Museum. I really enjoyed spending my time with y'all this evening, and I hope everyone found it worth their while.
It definitely would. We getting a lot of thank yous and great presentation in our Q&A and in our chat.
Awesome.
Thank you. Have an amazing evening.